Hi, this is Af Malhotra on Straight Talk with Af. So once again, I'm here in front of you, and I know you've tuned in because you love what we do. You love the fact that we talk to the most incredible guests about their books, about the topics that they care most about. And today is one such episode. I have a wonderful author, an attorney in past life, a news presenter, a journalist, a polymath with many, many hats. And I love speaking to folk who have a diverse existence, not just because of their background, their race, their color, and all of those good things, just because they have a diversity of experience, a diversity of perspective, a diversity of thoughts that they bring to the table, a diversity of experience and expertise that they bring to the table. And so today we have one such incredible individual. Welcome, 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 Shari Dunn. Thank you for coming on Straight Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, what a pleasure it is to have you. You've authored a wonderful book that was released on the 25th of Feb this year. That is called Qualified, and the sub heading is how competency checking and race collide at work. I'll repeat that: how competency checking and race collide at work. Wow, this is a spicy topic for all of us around the world. I know you're based in the United States, but you have a global viewpoint. In fact, the book
Yeah.
that you've authored, which, by the way, I encourage all of you to type in qualified in Amazon, because that's a universal platform, and go buy the book. I've just ordered my copy. I was privileged to have the PDF copy, but I ordered the copy too. And go read it. And, I like to read chapter by chapter. That's kind of my thing. And you've just drawn me to one of the chapters that I'm going to start with. But before I do talk about that chapter, because of course I'm based in the UK, so I'm going to skip a few chapters and go into that chapter. Tell us about, I guess you've had this question a billion times, like what inspired you to write the book and so on and so forth. But I want to ask you a different question. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to go back even further than the book,
Okay.
because one of the things about Straight Talk and about my life and your life and everyone I've had on the show is your personal story. It's a little bit
Hmm.
about, before you became really cool and successful and
when did that happen?
you did, and before you started doing divorce and custody. My sister is a divorce custody lawyer in the UK, so I get the trials and tribulations of that, and all the other good work you also did with legal aid and supporting people who needed that level of representation, and then media, and now becoming an author. What was your life before that? Like, where are you from? Tell us
Oh,
about
yeah.
a little bit about your background, whether it's your parenting, your family, your siblings. I'm really interested in that because it tells the audience a lot about who you really are, and then of course the stuff in the middle we can read about.
Yeah, well, I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which in the United States is the industrial Upper Great Lakes Midwest. So when people think of the Midwest, sometimes people from other places think of Kansas and Missouri, but people from Missouri will get mad. But if you were a slaveholding state, I'm just not calling you the Midwest. But that's how they feel. But the industrial Upper Midwest would be Wisconsin, Michigan, um, and Minnesota. We're kind of up there. And so it is a very specific kind of place. And I call it the industrial Midwest because it was that. And so I come from a union family, working class people, grew up in a all working class Black neighborhood, which is something I always tell people no one knows exists or existed. From a media perspective, African Americans in the United States are either, really poor like Good Times or really wealthy like the Cosbys. Whereas
Mm.
for most people, just like most people anywhere, they're working class people. And the story of working class African Americans just does not get a lot of lift. People don't know we exist for some reason. So, I'm from a very, specific time and place. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when I was a kid, was predominantly white. Now it is almost majority Black.
Mhm.
So, but I grew up in a place that was hyper segregation between where you live. And I was bused to school. I was part of something called the Chapter 220 program, which was voluntary busing. So some people may know, may not know that busing was a way that white communities got around housing integration. So they wouldn't do housing immigration, but they would let you send your kids to their really good schools. So I was bused to a suburban public school, but it was a really good school. And consequently, that, kicks off a series of events that has me go to college at Marquette University, which is a Jesuit college in Milwaukee, and then law school at Northwestern's now Pritzker Law School in Chicago, Illinois. So yeah, it's a very, and to me, I still think of myself in those terms as a working class person from a working class community. And it really informs how I see things very practically, very directly, without a lot of artifice.
Hmm, beautiful. I was getting goosebumps when you were narrating your story, and the reason for that is because it's easily forgotten. Your past is easily forgotten in the busyness of your current status and success. And we all do
Mhm.
it to some extent because, of course, we're able to create new realities all the time. And the reason I'm inspired by that story, and a very brief one, I'm sure there's so much more to it, your personal experiences of going on that bus and how you were accepted or rejected or whatever it may be. I'm sure those are your personal stories. Maybe you should write about that too, if you haven't already in the book, because those are very captivating. But I think the real takeaway for me when you just narrated that was the fact that we are a product of our traumas and
Mhm.
our triumphs as well, right? And I think that the traumas vary. Sometimes people have ill health, sometimes they lose family members, sometimes it's the pursuit of ambition, sometimes it's circumstances. Where were where you were born, how you were born
Mhm.
in a particular society, and so on. The ability to come out of that and to discover a new world and create a new reality is really massively underrated.
Yeah. Well, they call it social class transitioners. So, social class transitioners are people who move between classes. Although the fact of the matter is, in the United States anyway, most people are live and die pretty close to the class they were born in. We tell ourselves a different story here, but actually it's not. So actually transitioning classes is rare and very, very difficult. But it does give you different insight, and it gives you a different perspective. It makes you pay attention more. It gives you more dimensions to what you're looking at, how you're looking at things from different perspectives that other people aren't. So, I mean, it has its own value, its own challenges, and its own values.
Did you, if I may ask, do you have siblings?
I have one sister. She's older than me. Mhm.
And do you see the social class transitions happening across your immediate family and extended, or are you a rare
I would say
example?
my extended family, definitely. I mean, my mother was from a town in Mississippi called Mound Bayou. It was a historically all black town, one of the few historically all black towns in the United States. So they had their own schools, their own grocery store, their own hospital. And it was founded by formerly enslaved folks. But by the time she came along, they had lost a lot of wealth or access to money, and my mother picked cotton, you know.
Mm,
So this has been a big transition for, I think, all of my family, but it is built on the backs of civil rights legislation, affirmative action, and things like DEI.
mm,
So it wasn't because they weren't talented before, it was because they could not get access.
mm,
So that, yeah, so there, I mean, definitely there has been a social class transition across my entire family, but it would not have happened without the mandatory requirements that said at least consider this applicant, at least look at this person. You cannot outwardly discriminate. Those kind of things made all the difference.
mm, mm. This is a great segue into the book, of course, because that's just a small little glimpse into your background. So you wrote the book, I guess it was published recently, and why was there a need for you to write a book? Why did you write a book?
I wrote a book because the book said, write me. And I'm sure you've heard that before from authors, but there is this weird thing that happens. First of all, I never thought I would write a book. I didn't think I was a great writer per se. I'm a terrible speller and I'm probably not the best with grammar. And so I was like, there's no way I'm writing a book. But it's funny when the story is there, when it's there, it shows up and it's
Mm,
like, nope, you will write this. And, it was because I was hearing so much pain and suffering from people in my work as a consultant, and I was hearing the same stories and the same difficulties they were facing. And I'm like, I know this is systemic. I know this is a systemic problem. It's bigger. But some of the people were thinking they were in isolation. Some of the people were thinking they were the only people this is happening to. And I thought, well, no, this is ridiculous. Somebody's got to do something. And as I always like to say, I guess my name is somebody. So I wrote the book for myself, for the people I was consulting with, and ultimately to identify something that is dragging, I think, our system down.
mm. Okay, let's get into it. So, can you give us a synopsis of the book? What is this book about?
Okay, so qualified, how competency checking and race collide at work. I know competency checking is a mouthful. That is a piece of original scholarship on my part. And basically, what I set out to do was identify the specific mechanisms that were holding Black, other people of color, and women back in the workplace and the ways in which it operated. So, competency checking really examines the what, why, and how that women, Black folks, and other people of color have to meet a higher, harder standard to get employed, stay employed, and advance in employment, and what that specifically looks like when you break it down. Because as someone who's done this work, we talk about big terms, unconscious bias, or even intersectional, which it makes sense to me in an academic setting, but it doesn't always make sense to people. And
Right.
so what I thought was, what if I took the components of its part, broke it apart, traced it back in history? Why does it exist? Move it forward. How does it exist? How does it show up? And then what should you do? So that's really what the book is about.
Yeah, beautiful. And I want to give one example to the audience as to how you've done this so well. It's remarkable. You talked about, I know you and I, by the way, feel the same about imposter syndrome, but I love the fact that you traced it back to its origins. I don't want to steal your thunder. Could you just unpack that again? Because I think it's
No,
education
you can you
for
can you can talk
everyone.
about it. Yeah, imposter syndrome comes up in the book, and it's funny because it wasn't going to be a chapter. It was what happened was I was talking to a potential client about speaking for some event, and she was a white woman. It was actually two white women on the Zoom, and they were asking about me speaking at an event about imposter syndrome.
Hmm.
And I said, oh, well, sure, but let me tell you my framing. And I told her my framing that imposter syndrome was a misidentification of the impact of competency checking. So when you are in a space and people are checking whether you know what you're doing, what are you doing there, yeah, of course you're going to feel uncomfortable. That is the symptom, not the illness. And then I said to her, I said, well, this is based on really scant research, from 73 to 78, like 170 something upper middle class white women that seemed to ignore the historical context in which these women were living and da da da. And the woman just was so taken aback. And she said to me, well, I spoke to a consultant who said anybody who won't admit to imposter syndrome is either a liar or a narcissist. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We have gone way too far. And so that is how I ended up writing the chapter, because I see imposter syndrome specifically as it impacts white women as a diversion that has led them away from collective action, thinking that individual correction is the source of the problem, which is not to say that everybody doesn't feel insecure. Everybody doesn't sometimes feel unsure of themselves. That is not a syndrome. That's not like a psychological disorder. And the problem is we are covering up, and again, specifically for white women, we're covering up the impact of competency checking and systemic issues with this thing called imposter syndrome, which doesn't motivate them toward collective action. And that to me is a real problem.
Yeah. And I think one of the most interesting things about this is a lot of research and research studies. I'm a anthropology major back in the day, but I also studied psychology. And as I think back to all of the experiments that were done, a Zimbardo, a Hertzberg model, and various others there at Pavlov and classical conditioning and all of the other models that we were taught. One of the things I keep questioning now, coming from an Indian background originally, I live in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
is I study a lot of the ancient sort of manuals and some of the scientific and also spiritual books that are out of India that are unrelated to religion, and many of them thousands of years old now. Many of them are just absolutely incredible because they have the solutions to a lot of problems that humanity is facing today. Even if you're looking at the Kama Sutra, which people think is a very naughty book about sex, actually it's about energy fields. It's about its elevation and state and flow more than
Mm-hmm.
anything, not sexualized the way it is today. And then I started to question all of these, like your example of the context of the study. A lot of this has been done in the Western world by, it seems to be by white people. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's not accurate or the case, but as I know about the Asian civilization, I know maths and the number zero and algebra was actually invented in another part of the world. And
Mm-hmm.
so why I'm stating this is because I think maybe we have to now question a lot of research that was done a
Mm-hmm.
long time ago that's defining you and I and everyone
Yeah.
else who apparently are DEI people on the planet, because maybe the rule book needs to be thrown out and recreated. Because I guess there's so much conflict between theories and belief systems. Unconscious bias is another one that I'm not a big fan of generally. And what you and I understand to be the experiences that we've been through. And of course, also mechanisms for coping moving forward. So
Mm-hmm.
tell me what your thought is around that. And it's a bit of a controversial point, but hey, we need to challenge the status quo here because otherwise we're sort of carrying through models
Mm-hmm.
like imposter syndrome. In fact, we should sort of chuck them in the dustbin or the trash can and move forward with new models that we haven't even considered so far.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is the limitations of the research when you center your knowledge, and I talk about in the book, the research may have come to a different conclusion if they had have prominently featured working class or poor white women, even. Because I give the example in the book of a woman named Crystal Lee Sutton, who was immortalized in a movie called Norma Ray,
Right.
which is a very old movie that Sally Field was in, where she played a union organizer in the South at a textile plant. And I make that contrast. So Crystal Lee Sutton was like, wait a minute, this company is sexist and racist. And I'm going to do something that at the time in the early 70s was not done still, which is I'm going to work cross racially with Black women at this plant. And we're going to work together to unionize this place. And there's a famous scene where she stands up on a table and holds up a sign and doesn't say anything, it just says union, right? That type of solidarity was possible because she didn't see what was happening to her as an individual failing. She saw it as a system failing. And so the problem with a lot of research that centers us, it doesn't even look outside of itself, is that maybe even the research concept wasn't bad, but the limitations of the subjects and the queries are bad.
Right. Yeah.
And what is difficult, I think, for people who have always positioned themselves as kind of all knowledgeable, and that would be whiteness as a entity, not as an individual. And that is a distinction. I'm not saying like, oh, hey, if you're listening to this and you're white, you think you know everything. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying culturally, whiteness has positioned itself as the as all knowing in a
Yeah.
sense. And because of that, it is missing other dimensions of things that are happening because it's just not expanding its viewfinder big enough, right? And so a big part of the problem with this study was the viewfinder was too narrow, and then it was extrapolated too wide. But then the second part of that is the extrapolation of imposter syndrome has been a moneymaker, a exploitation point that other people picked up and ran with, right? And it's an easy thing to say. And then we've built a whole culture around it, so there's
Yeah.
all these things going on. But to your point, I think that is the whole point about why diversity of people, of places, of ideas matters, because your research, your data, your solutions are poorer without those additional elements, without understanding that you are missing something. So yeah, I think it's a combination of those things.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you some provocative questions because this is what it's about, really. And, we have a real conversation like I would if I was with you face to face. So I'm going to first start with the objections that I see in the DEI space, because your book is intrinsically linked with that topic, of course. The first one is really, if you now consider where we are in the government that your country has, and I'm happy to say I'm in the UK. I'll take the fact that I'm in the UK for now. It's probably an advantage, and where you are with the executive orders and so on and so forth. We are where we are and so on and so forth, and we won't sort of theorize that. We understand. Now, there is a school of thought that says that DEI, just before Trump came into power with a Democrat, it got to a point, because sort of the DEI mission and campaign, not diversity per se, that was equality, that's been happening all over the world for a long time through policies and anti-discrimination acts and various other things. But the DEI campaign, post, I guess, George Floyd and so on and so forth, the rise of that, the euphoric rise of that on a hype curve, there is a school of thought that was very much about the elevation of the Black community, not really about other racial communities. And so that's the objection that I've got as part of my work on the Diversity Economics Institute. How would you and by the way, and the point I'm making is, it was a politicized campaign by the Democrats, and it just went out of control, and the music became too jarring, and therefore it had to collapse. I want to handle that point, not go into the fascist right wing argument yet. How would you react to that as independently as possible?
Well, it's hard to react to it without the fascist right wing conversation, because the reason is because you have organizations like the Claremont Institute specifically, who have spent several decades undermining any attempts at a multiracial, multicultural society. And they have worked extremely hard at this. And I
Right.
call them the hidden hand in the
Right.
book,
Yeah.
because they are hidden. They create a type of hysteria at every turn. So affirmative action was, oh, you're just giving Black people jobs, in the 60s, which it was not. But organizations like this have been incredibly good at shaping and forming public opinion and skewing public. We are all victims of or exist in a marketing landscape. And we don't know we're being marketed to. We don't know, because we don't know what something is. If somebody tells us what it is, that's what it is. And they have been so good at this, because they do not, at the end of the day, want a multicultural, multi-gendered, multi-ethnic society. They want a society that prioritizes whiteness, full stop. That's the
Right.
end of that story. And so, as it relates to George Floyd, I would say that America has never had a full reckoning or a solution that prioritizes addressing anti-Blackness. We just have not. Now, people think we have. Freeing people from slavery and giving them nothing doesn't address anti-Blackness.
Mm.
Civil Jim Crow, which picks up after the end of slavery, goes another 100 years, segregates Black people specifically. There's some wiggle room in Jim Crow for people of color who are not Black, for other folks. We did not have that.
Mm.
Then we get to civil rights legislation, which predominantly impacts white people, white women, and ethnic white people more than Black people. So we are still waiting for a solution to address the impact of anti-Blackness. And so one would say that after the murder of George Floyd, that is actually the first time there was a full-throated discussion about the true impact of anti-Blackness in our societies and in our workplace. And that pushback goes back to something I talk about in the book that happened after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which is something the author of the book I cite calls the screen of racial contempt. Keeping that screen of racial contempt up and in place is super important for white supremacy. That screen of racial contempt has started to come down, where people said, wait a minute, there is something problematic about what's going on. But just as quickly as that happened, you saw benefits of this work that, again, outstripped any impact for Black people, LGBTQIA, white women, other minorities. In fact, I think Black Americans talk about the brownwashing of DEI, where anybody who has any color is diverse, and we still don't get an accurate addressing of anti-Black bias, which is not to say there's anything wrong with the fact that DEI work elevated LGBTQIA. That was something that many companies were way more comfortable addressing
mm,
than
mm,
they were anti-Blackness.
mm,
Women in the workplace, something many companies are more comfortable addressing. So, at this point, we're still waiting
mm,
for a modality to fully address the impact, the unique impact of anti-Black bias in the United States, because it is quite unique.
mm, mm. Well put. And I guess my next question really is then, if you think about, and the person will remain nameless, obviously, but I ended up speaking to someone a couple of weeks ago who was super senior in the banking world in the United States, in particular, because we'll come to the UK in a moment. It's different in the UK for a lot of reasons. And that person, shocked me really because he sort of turned around and we spoke about DEI. Very flippant
Mhm.
and dismissive. When
Mhm.
people are flippant and dismissive, there's no dialogue. But anyway, I just talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, and he jumped to. He said, "Oh, it's just absolutely useless. Waste of time. I had such diverse people. I had Asian people. I had Japanese people. I did it, but I didn't have any black people, and they said I'm not DEI. Just absolutely useless, absolutely useless." And so, help me understand to what extent is that again lack of tolerance and maybe some deep rooted discrimination and prejudice anyway. 'Cause I sensed it towards maybe the black community
Yeah,
versus it being you saying, Af, no, you are right. There are episodes and instances where it was out of hand, where there was a level of balance, and circumstantially, actually, a person probably couldn't source or find someone who was from the black community. That just was a case. Um, I want to just try and get a reality check on it, simply because I don't
yeah,
live there, and a lot
yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah,
audiences are watching from other parts of the world.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the idea that out of hand is a problem, right? Because the access to opportunity being out of hand is in and of itself super questionable. Like, what does that mean? The the resetting of a playing field that has been tilted in favor of white people to be level is what people mean when they talk about something being out of hand. Um, as far as the work itself, I mean, there are tons of consultants. I used to be, as you all call in the UK, a presenter. I used to be in television news, and we'd have these consultants who came who were ridiculous. They would say outrageous things. They were very discriminatory toward African Americans around anchoring. Nobody put them out of business. Nobody said that was out of hand. There are these executive firms that decide who is leadership potential. Many of these firms do not consider race and gender properly, and they act. I mean, I think it was Corn Ferry actually who did a study on the fact that there are Black P&L leaders. They just simply can't get through the process.
Hmm.
So the pipeline isn't empty, it's blocked by perception and by a host of consultants who are out of hand. But the negative impact they have is not held up as some systemic great societal downfall, when in fact it has. It has been blocking Black folks and women and other people of color from leadership and executive positions. It's a system wide problem. But
Hmm.
because people don't see that, they don't see that as a problem.
Hmm.
Now, the executive who talked about this reminds me of the executive at Wells Fargo who got dragged for saying that there were no Black people in all of the United States who could be in his executive team. And one thing I point out in the book is that man got his first job out of college because of a family connection with Jamie Dimon, right? So, on the one hand, there is a whole system set up to prioritize ease of access. And then there's another system set up, which what I call fine wire mesh inside it, which acts as an extruding force, which makes you think there's no one in the pipeline because when it comes to African Americans, they have to meet every qualification. And this is McKinsey and Korn Ferry. So these are not, I'm not talking about some super liberal think tanks. They have to meet a higher, harder standard than any others to even be considered.
Right.
How was Charles Scharf qualified for that job with Jamie Dimon right out of college?
Hmm.
He wasn't,
Hmm.
but he had access. So we have a whole other system of hiring, which is referral based hiring, which still accounts for 30 to 40% of all of our hiring. And that is a vestige of the gentry in the United States, right? Because that's how everybody was hired when it was all white Protestant males. A letter of introduction, da 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 da. That's how hiring was done in the United States, probably until World War One started to shift it when men came back from the war and wanted access. But World War II was the big advancement with the GI Bill, which opened up education. And that is when we first started to see big social class transitioning.
Mm,
But referral based hiring kept itself.
mm,
It still holds as, and you were talking earlier about a vestige of something we need to get rid of. That's a vestige of something we need to get rid of
mm.
because it provides a unseen entry point that does not always hold those entrants to the same standard of people coming in the front door. And the fact that someone says, I can't find anybody Black and that the pipeline isn't there is a lie. And that's just all it is. And we know that Black people tend to be underemployed, meaning in positions not commensurate with their education or experience. So you can laterally hire up. That's an example I give in the book. And
Yeah,
that is justified because they do not get the advancement opportunities. So there's, if a person was a serious person,
yeah.
they would know that that is a ridiculous statement. And and really at its root, it is about an American hostility to Blackness that is still very much deeply rooted in our psyche, which is why I spend the first 3 pages of the book addressing that. Like
Mm,
the first 3 chapters, I mean,
mm.
why is that? And I think people wonder, and that's why I thought I couldn't write this book without explaining that in full.
Yeah, yeah. Can we, if it's okay, can we move to the United Kingdom for a moment? Because
Yeah, let's move to the UK.
we have now a really good backdrop of the state of affairs and the history of race and the situation that you've beautifully probably articulated, and now, of course, on the show related to the United States. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's now look at the differences and I guess the behaviors that you find in one of your chapters. Tell us about this chapter that you've written and your
Yeah,
understanding of how it's different in the United Kingdom and Canada and other parts.
yeah. So I did a chapter called It's Not Just Black and White or American because,
Okay.
it was really important to me that I do expand the lens, right? We were talking about earlier. So I want to make sure that my lens expands. So the book is squarely settled in the impact of anti-Blackness, but the impact of anti-Blackness isn't just on Black people. It negatively impacts white people. It negatively impacts other people of color who are caught up in this whirlwind of a continual problem. Like it impacts a lot of people. So I thought, well, you know what? I really need to make sure bring that point home. Like I don't just say it. So that's why I have this chapter, and the chapter starts focusing on Asian. And the reason is because Asian Americans and Black Americans in particular are pitted against each other in a white supremacist narrative about why is this group successful and this group not successful, and we don't
Mhm.
show what is underneath and we don't disaggregate. So I get into the different treatments and the different responses for South Asians, Southeast Asians, and East Asians in the United States, and they are different, but they're kind of covered up by the term Asian. So
Mhm.
then I thought, okay, well, I also need to think about internationally. So I got an email or a message on LinkedIn from a woman in France when I started talking about the book. And she was like, oh my gosh, this is happening to us here. We really need to talk about this here. And so I was like, okay. So anyway, that's how I got to the chapter. And then what I found in the UK was something almost kind of shocking was that first of all, the impact of Black Lives Matter in the UK was significant, which is also, just to reiterate this point, the impact of Black advocacy movements in the United States have impacted the world from emancipation to Jim Crow, and which was served as a model for Nazism and apartheid South Africa, to the civil rights movement, which brought in movements all around the world. So we get a lot of blame and we don't get a lot of credit for the fact that our movements changed the world, right?
Very true.
So the impact of Black Lives Matter in the UK was really, I think, shocking to a lot of African Americans who also brought this notion that the UK had this class-based system, but it didn't have as much race-based issues and this kind of thing, which ended up being not true, and certainly not fully true. And one of the things was some data I found in the book, which there was an article that someone wrote, two authors. It says the greatest trick racism ever pulled was convincing England it doesn't exist.
Hmm.
And they had this data that nearly 2 in 3 Black people in the UK um, say that there has not been enough done to address historical and present racial injustice. And then this figure I thought was really something. There was a report from the UK called Broken Ladders, and it says a staggering 75% of women of color reported experiencing racism at work. Half of Pakistani, Bangladeshi women, and nearly half of Black African women reported they faced criticism for their behaviors tolerated by colleagues. Now, there was very similar data I cite in this book about Black women in the United States. So, what was shocking is that the data, the language, the issues were similar,
Hmm.
and they actually weren't that different. That was what was disheartening and shocking, but also made me think about collective international action about a right to work,
Hmm.
about the fact that Black and other people of color have a right to dignity in the workplace and have a right to work unmolested about who they are and their identities. And then there was a report by Coquille research found that 52% of Black heritage women in the UK were considering leaving their current job. Now, that matched up with some research in the United States that found that 50% of multicultural women. So I mean, we're even Steven here. So
Okay.
what I found in the UK is there's a bit of a cover up of the impact of race. And just like in the United States, having your first prime minister of color or having our first Black president didn't fundamentally change systemic systems around
Absolutely.
race, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And may I add something to that, which is quite interesting. You know, your book title got me really, I was sort of thinking to myself, I have to say this to you, Shari. So in the UK, it goes the other way. So I remember back in the day when my mother, she had two masters when we migrated here. We were economic migrants. She was a lecturer in a university teaching English lit, by the way, in Delhi, in New Delhi in India. And we migrated in 1988, and she's super qualified. And of course, a brown woman, okay? And she didn't have the English accent. So she had an Indian English sort of accent. And she was applying for jobs, equivalent jobs that she would have had
Mhm.
in India, of course, because you know she would. Why wouldn't she? Anyway, you know what the next part of the story is. She was apparently overqualified.
Oh, yeah.
So that's another. When I was thinking of qualified, you people might think, oh, are you qualified? Are you underqualified? Well, in fact, here a nice way of saying no, thank you very much. Not on my watch. You're not coming into this organization because you're different. Was I think you're overqualified, and
Oh,
this
that happens
continues.
here.
Yeah, it
That
happens there
happens
as well.
here. Oh, yeah. Black people
Deeply
get that all the
frustrating.
time. Black women tend to show up with advanced degrees a lot. And actually, one of the advanced degrees Black people do get pretty much commensurate with their percentage of population is MBAs. Like, I don't know why
Right,
Black people like MBAs.
right.
So they get that all the time. They're overqualified. I had a woman tell me once, well, you know, you would be qualified to do my job. And she didn't say it in a nice way,
Mm,
like, you know, and it's really like I'm not comfortable, but that goes back to the competency checking element I talk about in the book, which is the fear of leadership,
mm.
of Black leadership or leadership of people of color. You would be in charge of me with these qualifications, and that I cannot have.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is an element of competency checking, because at the end of the day, you're not qualified for this leadership position.
Mm,
And you know, this issue about accent is interesting because I tell people, look, when we hear Irish accents in the United States, British, French, we don't
right.
think a person is unqualified or something's wrong with their English, and we totally tolerate that. But the
Mm,
moment somebody has a Spanish accent, Hispanic accent, a South Asian accent,
mm.
now they're not. We don't know what they're saying. You know, so it's still that shifting standards model. You shift your standards of what is qualifications based on who's in front of you. And so consequently, you're either too qualified or not qualified enough. But at the end of the day, that's about keeping you out of the system. And that's why I say that the pipeline isn't empty, it's blocked. You have intentionally blocked the system. And then we have this. So if your mother would have gotten that job in 70 something, whatever that job was, the level of lifetime experience and skills she would have had by now in that would have been much higher. So
Hmm.
by the time we actually get the opportunity to enter, you've been running in the United States anyway, a several 100-year race. We've had 50 years to enter it. And then you tell me, oh, you're all caught up. I mean, that's
Hmm.
bananas, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
So yeah, so yeah, we hear that. You're too qualified. We hear that a lot.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, and I think the other issue is let's talk about class for a moment, because I think whether we like it or not, and us Britishers, we're very good at this. Actually, we've probably exported this out to the rest of the world, the clubs and the Rotary clubs and this club and that membership club, and we have hundreds and hundreds of these clubs just in London alone, where you have to pay for a membership and then you're part of one club, and it's all about the word you used earlier, access,
Hmm.
access. And even to this day, I'm privileged to have understood the system. I'm in my late 40s now, so I've understood the system, and lucky enough to have education and pathways that have got me here, and I'm trying to make a difference, of course, now the way I can. But even to this date, the the class divide is so clear, and surprise, surprise, the class divide does have a homogenous nature to it, right? With mostly white people in at least in the Western world. So, with that context, a few arbitrary questions. The first one is, look, we are where we are, right? We are where we are. You've written this book. We're going to read it. People are going to read it. Let's first talk about the people that are going to come after you and I, the next few generations. So let's talk about Generation Z, Gen Z, and my kids who are 6 and 4, Gen Alpha, as they're called. So tell me a little bit about how you see your book impacting that generation directly or indirectly, at least the Gen Z who are like in their, early 20s, teens, and so on.
Well, the Gen Z is partly why I wrote the book because many of them are in the workplace and they expressed a lot of devastation when they realized that things hadn't changed as much as they were led to believe. And that was heartbreaking
Right.
as a consultant. I always tell people the when I am consulting with white people about race, people say, "Oh my gosh, how can you hear the things people say?" And I'm like, "That doesn't bother me. I'm really interested in what people think, and I want to help people see another way of thinking things. So it doesn't bother me. But what was emotionally hard were the consulting work with young people of color. They just were so hurt and so confused about what was going on. I am old enough to understand how systems of oppression and racism work. And I understood coming into this system that it wasn't a system designed for me. Some of them didn't know that. And when they hit that wall or when they hit that conversation, it hurt them very deeply. And so they are actually another reason why I wrote the book, to give voice to something that people were really afraid to give voice to. And
Mm,
so my hope is that the book will, first of all, affirm that they're not going crazy, that, these things are happening to them. And then it will inspire them to change and to deconstruct things like imposter syndrome and call out competency checking. And I hope it encourages the next generation. In fact, I just spoke at a large university here in Oregon to 600 first year business students. And I did a keynote. And my goal with that is to try to give them the tools so that they can be better leaders, whatever the system and society is saying to them, that they have the abilities to change, to reduce referral based hiring, to not competency check women and Black folks and other people of color. To They don't have to live in that perpetual cycle, right? So I think the only way you can do that is by illuminating what's happening and then giving them that roadmap. And so that is the goal. And then my cousin has a little daughter who's 6, Sloan, who wants me to say her name so she can be famous. But
yay.
yeah,
Go Sloan.
so I don't, I partly dedicate the book to her too. do not want her to have to go through these things. I don't want her to continuously fighting this fight. I thought about this the other day. I went to see Sinners, the movie. It's making big splash here in the United States, and I think internationally. I don't know if Sinners is out yet
Yeah,
internationally,
I've
but
watched it. Yes, of course.
yeah. And they mention my mother's hometown in the movie, Mound Bayou, Mississippi. They mention it as a place of refuge and a great town, and tells the young character he should go there. And then I thought, wow, look, that representation, to hear my mother's hometown in this international movie as a place of dignity and refuge for Black folks. But then I think, oh, I'm still doing this. Like, we're still fighting the same fight. And my hope of writing this book is that people after me do not have to still fight the same fight. But
Mm,
Gen Z is going to have to fight this fight. I can't,
mm,
I mean, this is not abating while they're here. So,
mm. There is a positive side to this. I mean, I certainly feel, having spoken to a lot of people who are in the Gen Z space, there is there's a major upgrade they have versus at least my generation, which is the level of awareness on social issues and the drive and I guess passion that they have to be the beacons of hope for causes like climate, like race, like DEI, and I guess there is also an aspect of them appreciating that people do have their own personal stories, and respecting
mhm.
that diversity is just a part of human existence and can be very good for society and friendships, be it virtual or physical, in real life or on TikTok or whatever channel. I feel hopeful about that, definitely. I think there is that level of sensitivity that my generation just wasn't even aware of. Like, we weren't even
Well,
aware of that.
I'll tell you this. You're going to be like, this lady is so. Well, there's hope, but there's also reason for fear and concern. And that is
Sure.
because there has been an unlimited attempt through social media, gaming platforms to reverse that. And there
Mm,
hasn't been a good, effective countermeasure. There is sexist, racist material on the internet that is poisoning a new generation of young people.
true.
And if we think that they have not been affected by that, we think that at our peril. And I think it actually presents a great danger because most of us didn't know what was going on. Over 2 decades of intentional work through gaming systems, through social media platforms to re radicalize around misogyny,
Mm,
racism, um, uh, to young white people, and they are doing a good job. And so we have to be just as intentional in countering that message. We have
mm,
to be just as thoughtful in finding our ways onto these platforms, because yes, there is a group of young people, but people have been saying that about young people since the 60s. Oh, these young people, they're in the 60s, they're Woodstock, they're going to save the world around race. They didn't. And then the 80s, the United Colors of Benetton. Oh, everybody's all racially ambiguous. They didn't. And so we can't put all that pressure. Like, we have to still have a responsibility to educate them. And we have to pay attention to what is going on now in a way that we don't even have access to, which is
mm.
the internet and these gaming platforms. So I do just want to give that word of caution for young people, because I have seen a shift, a scary and hateful shift. And you all have the half UK, half British guy who's well known for his
Yes. Sorry,
misogyny, but
sorry, sorry about that. Yeah.
his impact is significant. It
Yes,
is
unfortunately.
significant. And it went unchallenged for the
Mm,
longest time. So we got to remember they're there, and we got to give them an alternative story and messaging. And really, for me, a lot of this fight, if you want to call it that, is that we just don't have really good messaging
mm.
or really good language on this side to counter what are really appealing, apparently, messages on the other side.
Yeah. Fair play. I mean, I think that's well said, well articulated, and you're right. I mean, there are two sides to a coin, and I think whilst there is hope, there's also a sense of fear and concern. Another few things I just wanted to say. I know we're running out of time, but if you think about the next generation of employees, and I bring in AI because, of course, I come from the AI world as well, there is this entire generation that will be working in gig format. i.e., they'll be working on the back of a laptop with whatever skill sets and degrees, qualified, unqualified, depending on how you want to, distinguish qualified versus unqualified. And they are making money. They are making good money, and they are doing jobs, and their names don't matter. Their work matters, right? Their output matters, be it designing a website or creating code. And there are numerous platforms and marketplaces like Fiverr and various others where you can go on today and register yourself as a person with a skill, whatever your skill may be, and then get work and get paid for that
Hmm.
work. So there is one theory. I had one of my guests, Risha Tabakawala, is a great author. I'm sure if you've heard of him, he's on his second or third book. The last book he wrote was called Rethinking Work. He was on the show 2, 3 episodes ago. And Risha was also the ex-board member of Publicis Group, which is the big PR company. And he speaks of this new generation of workers who may not be inside offices necessarily in physical workplaces for 1,000 reasons, but will be virtual and will be fractional in the sense that I work at Pepsi for 3 days a week, but for 2 days I am an independent contractor, and that's well understood. And uh, maybe, and why I'm making that point is maybe, I don't know, maybe there is an equalizer approach here to people working regardless of their DEI backgrounds, but just doing great work with their skills. What are your thoughts on that? I'm not saying it's a solution, but I'm saying it's a trend that is rising.
Well, I think in the United States, we are in trying to retreat back, and
Yes.
we don't want that. We have an administration that is extremely hostile to remote work, and this is economic, and it's also about our history. We are really, it's a, you know, the United States has many, many great qualities. And I talk about this in the book. I wrote the book because I love the country and its people. So I don't hate the United States. This is a misnomer. Um, but in saying that, I say the United States is very much tied to a slave based system. I mean, it really is something that is still in us. And to have workers where we can control them and see them. And, COVID gave us this opportunity to break out of that. And yet they're trying to force us back into that. And
Mm,
so I think we do ourselves a disservice, and we'll put ourselves behind competitively with this and with this retreat. And to your point, a lot of people of color liked remote work. It took the stress of microaggressions, macroaggressions off of them.
mm,
It allowed them to focus specifically on their job and have that do the talking, as opposed to, having to deal with all these other things. But then there is still this concern that, wait a minute, there's still going to be an inside track that I don't have access to. And so how do you balance that even in a virtual space for
yeah.
advancement? But I think it presents an intriguing opportunity, because it does force us to address the content more than the person who we are interacting with. But that doesn't get rid of all of our biases, right? Because I mean, there's been some research and testing that when we know a document or a research project or whatever comes from a certain person, we kind of shift how we look at it. So there is still that would have to be addressed. But I think that there were a lot of women and people of color who looked at remote work during COVID and was like, thank God. Like, and I tell people, like, we've been working like it's 1886 still. It's like we still are using a rotary phone when it comes to work.
Yeah.
And COVID gave us a way to jump forward. And in the United States anyway,
Yeah.
for economic control and historical reasons around how we see workers, we're trying to push a genie back into a bottle. And I don't think it's going to stay there. I think it is going to retreat. But I think ultimately, and this is where the next generation comes, I think they're going to force their way back.
Mm,
Although, to be fair, some of them complained that they didn't have that socialization that they wanted in the workforce, and they felt alienated. And I told someone younger, I said, well, the socialization I had in the workforce in the 90s, you wouldn't want that. Like,
yeah.
it's a lot of shenanigans, people getting too drunk, people doing, like, it's not this great, mentoring environment you might think it is. And I
Yeah.
think if we find other ways to do that, mentoring environments and things like that, maybe we can continue the march forward. But in the United States, I think we're going to be diverted a bit in that
Yeah.
because we have some folks in power who are reflexively hostile,
Yeah.
because they're reflexively hostile to freedom, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head. Let me ask you this. Since releasing the book, and I guess you've been speaking at events, and you talked about the university you went to speak at. You're on this podcast, and I know you've done a few other podcasts. Are you seeing any interesting? Are you seeing any sort of? Firstly, what's the appetite like? Number one, because I guess your book is about the topic that is not so hot and popular, and it's been demonized by the current administration. Number one, first question. My second question is: these podcasts you're invited to, how many of those podcasts are people who are not DEI background? Podcasters.
All of them. None of the podcasters are DEI background people or anything like that. Just a wide variety of people. The imposter syndrome resonates really heavily with white women. So that seems to be an easy entry door
Right.
to the bigger topic for white women. So that seems to be like I know a lot of the television I've done, TV shows have focused on that because it is the accessibility point, which is funny again because it was like it's the shortest chapter and it's chapter I almost didn't write, but it ends up being the accessibility point. And on the one hand, DEI is being pushed, trying to be strangled out of existence, but on the other hand, Qualify is a book right of this moment.
Right.
It couldn't, I thought about that. Started writing this book 2 years ago, obviously, and it gets printed. And I changed course at some point in writing the book. I was writing it one way, and then I started writing it another way, and
Mm,
it was almost like divine intervention because the book is for this moment, and
mm,
I think it addresses everything that is going on. Why people are attacking these concepts? What is this about? What is actually the impact? What is the dollar impact? What does the data say? What does a path forward look like? Why are we doing this? So the book ends up being squarely situated right at the right moment. And but I also think people are exasperated and tired and confused. I mean, there's been a lot of books out about race and race in the workplace, and some of them are great, but I really wanted to, like I say, give you the what, the how, the why, and then what to do.
hmm.
And I think that a lot of books haven't done that. And I think this sets this book apart.
Yeah. Are you thinking about your next book?
Yeah, a little bit. It's funny. I had the pleasure of going back to my law school with one of my professors who's 82 and spoke to his class, his law and social change class, about the book. And he asked me that. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how we think about victims and why we are so uncomfortable with the victim, but much more comfortable with victimizers. Like, I'm curious about that. Having done divorce and custody for victims of domestic violence, no one is a victim anymore. Everybody's a survivor.
Mm,
And I'm interested about why we attach so much shame to victims and even the word,
mm.
and not to victimizers. So anyway, that's something that's kind of bubbling in my head. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. There is this beautiful quote, and maybe it's Oscar Wilde, maybe I've forgotten, which is "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken."
Yeah.
And I like that quote because in the construct of the world we live in today, like you and I, over the last 5 decades, a lot of it has been dominated by American capitalistic thinking, whether you like it or not. Whether you're in, in Bangalore in India, or you are in
Hmm.
Tokyo, or you're in London, or of course in New York City, and in the busyness of making it happen and working hard to prosper and be wealthy and build a great company, like my world's the startup world, build a great company, do it fast, make a great big company, unicorn. And the aspirations pieces, I think, way out of hand, and I think we've lost the plot. But in the busyness of all of that, there is something that's really important, which is humanity. And I think we were all 8 billion of us now, we were all brought into this sort of this world, this planet Earth, to actually be human, which I know has the vices and the bad side of it as well. And war will evidence that throughout history. And then there's the other side of us, which is incredible, like, laughter, love, compassion, consideration, care, charity, um, and trust, all of these amazing values that make us who we are. Like this conversation you're having with me today, you've taken time, even if we detach from the concept of time, you've taken energy and brought your energy to this conversation, and you've taken the energy to write something and document it because you feel well, you felt it was important, and you now feel it's even more important. To your point, the timing is excellent. And maybe a lot of these books are about reconnecting with what makes us human, and maybe that's what we should try and do a little bit more. And I guess your next book is about what humans do to one another. It's, the taboo of victimization, or the elevation of victimization, versus hiding what the victimizer is really
Mm.
up to. So this is beautiful. How did today go for you? This is the first time we've met. I usually the first time I meet all my guests, but I'm always inspired by the learning experience that I go through. Today has been incredible. You've taught me a lot of things, many things that I'm going to ponder over. I go into the book and I'm going to move a few chapters and highlight a few things. I do the terrible thing of highlighting, so apologies,
No,
but
that's fine.
or writing notes, because then I remember. What's the sort of initial reaction to the last hour or so that we've been chatting?
Well, for me, I told somebody all of these things are like reverse psychology. It's like reverse therapy. I get to interrogate myself again through the conversations about why did I think that? Why do I think that? Why did I write that? And so, my background, I have an undergraduate degree in the history of philosophy. So, for me, it's always interesting to trot out the thinking cap and think about why do I think things. And so there isn't a bad conversation as far as I'm concerned, because if it's an exchange of ideas or it's causing me to hone home in on why I think what I think, then I think it's great. So yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for coming on the show. The book is a must purchase for all of you who are watching this show.
It's
Qualified.
right behind me. It's right
Oh,
behind
there,
me there.
there it is. I should have had it here. But Qualified: How Competency, Checking, and Race Collide at Work. It's on Amazon. Go buy the book. Have you got a website, or where
I
where can people
do.
find
It
you? Yeah.
is, yeah, my website is thesharidunn.com, and it's SharidUnn. So thesharidunn.com. And I'm on Substack,
Okay.
growing my Substack, and that is Shari, SharidUnn. So you can find me on Substack or my website, thesharidunn.com.
Terrific. Okay. And we're going to have all of that in the description of the episode when it comes out, so you can click on it, and so on and so forth. What a pleasure it's been talking to
Thank you.
you. Thank you so much. Good luck with the book. Let's get it out to as many people as possible. I certainly will have my copy. And when I do meet with you, I'm going to get you to sign the copy, because that's
I got to
something
get to the UK. I got plenty to
I
say
know.
over there.
Yeah, yeah. I think let's figure that out after this,
Mm,
because I think
mm.
there is a huge opportunity here, and also Europe, by the way, other
Yep.
parts, in Germany, the Nordics in particular, that we'll talk
Mm.
about. So happy to be the access point, if you will. But great having Shari on the show. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Do subscribe to the channel. The bottom right notification button is really important, so you get alerts on the next cool episode. I'm Af Malhotra signing off. Be well, stay happy, keep smiling, and may the force be with you.